before the battle, all of this stuff is grist for the mill, and it's worth looking into. And Stan and I have had a number of conversations. Stan says Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah could have been a nuclear blast. When they say a bright light was shone in their eyes, could have been lasers. So, where some people see religious explanations, Stan sort of sometimes sees UFO explanations. I don't know. But it's worth remembering that there's a longer history to the UFO phenomenon than just 1947 and beyond, that things were happening for centuries, perhaps even thousands of years before that. And it's always good to keep an eye on the big picture, even as you're trying to move forward.
Your film, Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Cases, when were you done with that one?
We're shooting now. I'm off to Washington, D.C. tomorrow to interview Bruce Maccabee and a couple of other folks.
So tell them hi for me, by the way.
I will. Dick Hall. We're going to be talking to Dick Hall as well. And a witness that I can't name, because if I named him, you'd know which case is on the list, and I'd ruin the surprise.
I understand.
But he's a former military officer, that's all I'll say, and it's a really good case. We go home for about a week, then we're off to the United Kingdom, where I'm speaking at a conference being put on by Stuart Miller of UFO Review up in Manchester, and then interviewing Nick Pope and Nick Redfern, and looking at some cases over there. Do the Yukon in July. Oops, I think I might have just given away what one of the cases is. I'll be up in the Yukon in July. And then that's pretty much it. Post-production, we should be done by late September or sometime in October. It's set to air on Canadian TV Space, which is our sci-fi channel for Americans listening. That's basically what Space is. Sometime probably in the late fall. It's already been pre-sold to Television New Zealand, so if there's anyone listening down under, as it were, hello. And that documentary will be coming to you sometime over the next year, half year. And hopefully we have a distributor out of the United Kingdom that's working very hard to try and get it sold into as many markets as possible so as many people as possible can see it.
Great. Now, where do you stand with Fields of Fear, the film about cattle mutilations?
Well, I was supposed to have that done 3 months ago.
So you're working on a couple films right simultaneously?
Yep, and actually we're in pre-production for a third documentary that I start shooting when I get back from the Fields of Fear, the Best Evidence journey, that has nothing to do with UFOs. It's about classical music.
My gosh, Paul, how do you keep them all together here?
I don't know. My fiancée keeps asking me the same thing, usually by phone. She's usually saying, "Why aren't you home?" But she works in the industry, too, so she understands.
We're going to end up with a UFO show that might have some classical music in it.
I've been thinking about that, actually, seeing if I could bring the two together. But the Fields of Fear one is interesting, and maybe in the next segment, I don't even know what time it is. We can talk about that in Fern Belzil and cattle mutilations. But Best Evidence, too. I'd like to talk about that, and maybe some of the cases that may or may not be on the list.
Yeah, we can do that. Does anybody ever, Paul, talk about occupants and ETs? I mean, we get all these stories about craft. Mm-hmm. What about the beings themselves? Because that fascinates me.
Sure, absolutely. There are no well, who knows? Maybe they are occupants. I don't know. There are no occupant cases on our top 10 list that we developed through a poll with a number of leading ufologists. Which might tell you something. The best UFO researchers in the world tend not to favor those cases, usually because they're single witness cases. Not always, but usually.
True.
We actually set a very stringent criteria for the film. You needed to have multiple witnesses, and multiple witnesses could include one witness backed up by corroborating evidence from, say, radar or physical evidence or something like that. Photographs could work, too. But it couldn't just be one guy or one gal saying, such and such came to me and I saw this happen, and off we go. Maybe it did, but those are not the best cases. You need cases that have multiple witnesses or corroborating evidence. Those are the best cases.
All right, let's talk about both those films when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. I'm George Norrie. You know, I want to believe that we've been visited by extraterrestrials. I want to believe that we are not alone in the universe. Remember that book by Walter Sullivan, We Are Not Alone? I want to believe all that. Then there's this little part of me, this teeny little part of me that says, George, we are alone. There is no one else. And that's kind of a lonely feeling, isn't it? We'll be back in a moment with our special guest, Paul Kimball, on Coast to Coast AM. Paul, this question, are we alone in the universe, which perplexes all of us, it is a lonely question. Do you have that same feeling that I do? I mean, it's kind of disappointing if we are.
Well, I have to say, George, even if we are, I just saw on ESPN that the Edmonton Oilers beat the Anaheim Ducks 5-4 tonight. So as a Canadian who hasn't seen a Canadian team win the Stanley Cup since '93, whether I'm alone or not, I feel good.
Yeah, because they beat my Detroit Red Wings as well, didn't they?
Sorry about that. I'm not even an Oilers fan, but all Canadians come together about very few things, and hockey is one of them. So, especially when we're traveling in the States. The other thing I'd like to add before I answer that question, going back to your question about occupant cases in the last segment, I was remiss. It didn't make our top 10 list, but I sort of said that no occupant cases received any real votes. The Betty and Barney Hill case did. Didn't make the list, so there's a clue it's not in the top 10, but it wasn't far from the top 10. Because it had multiple witnesses, it met our criteria. That's one that a lot of ufologists still rate very highly, and it's the one alien abduction case, and I'm very leery of the abduction phenomenon, but it's the one that I can't completely dismiss and the one that I still find interesting. So just wanted to clarify that. The occupant cases, we did have one that ranked very highly on our list.
Well, it is fascinating, too, that the one occupancy case that really started it all in terms of abductions still continues to be the best case of all of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because Betty Hill, and I talked about this in a blog column that I did some months ago, was always very, very critical of the modern abduction researchers, Bud Hopkins and others, and very, very critical of hypnosis, even though she underwent hypnosis herself. She called it what she underwent was medical hypnosis, and she had a disparaging view, and there's an interview in a magazine, the name of which I can't remember, but it's on my blog somewhere, where she basically really went after the modern abduction researchers. And I always found that interesting too. That sort of combativeness on her part, whether that was, my case was first and I wanted to remain special, or I think you guys are all nuts. And, you've turned this into an industry when in fact these are relatively unique and rare cases. I think my favorite quote from hers is, you should be very careful about people messing around in your mind. And that didn't come from a debunker, and it didn't come from a skeptic. It came from Betty Hill, perhaps the original abductee, or if not the original one, the best-known one. So very interesting. Are we alone in the universe? No. That's a short answer.
It is a short answer. Why do you believe that? You're a skeptic.
Well, I'm a skeptic as to whether any of them are coming here, and I'm a skeptic as to what the nature of life in the universe might be like, and that's a wide-open question. But the universe is a big place. Our galaxy is big enough, but the universe goes, forever. And I find it incomprehensible to believe that in this vast universe, we're it in terms of life. We might be it in terms of intelligent life, I don't know. But there's got to be life elsewhere. The odds alone favor that. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a scientist today who would say categorically there is no other life in the universe, we're it. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find very many scientists who would say on the balance of probabilities we think there isn't life in the universe. I think most scientists think there's some life out there somewhere. Some scientists, I think, even believe that maybe it's come here.
But they're basing it without proof.
Well, yeah, which is why I wouldn't say it's absolutely 100% proved, but I think the odds are in favor. I've been to Vegas enough to know that you should always play the odds. And I play poker every
smart.
2 weeks.
In Vegas, that's very smart.
Yeah, it seems to be smart in my biweekly poker game, too, although not always as smart as I think it is.
Well, what do you play, Texas Hold'em?
Oh, yeah, everybody plays Texas Hold'em now.
That's huge.
Haven't won in a couple of weeks, but I have won, and I always try and play the odds. And the odds say that there is life out there. Can we prove it? No. Best way to prove it, and where we've really fallen down over the last 35 years, is to go out there. That's one of the things that ufology, I believe, could have really benefited from doing, was trying to tie itself to the space exploration drive in the late 1960s into the 70s, and should be pushing for it today. If George Bush, no matter what you think of him, says, we want to go back to the moon and then on to Mars, everybody should line up behind him and say, absolutely, Mr. President, and whoever your successors are, because it won't be him that's right. There when it happens. You're darn right. We should be going back to the moon. We should never have left. and then we should be continuing on to Mars, and we should be continuing on after that. But if you look at the history of European exploration of North America, when the first explorers arrived, there tended to be a period afterwards where not much happened before they started to come in waves. And I think that's probably what happened with us when we went to the moon. We got there, we took a look around, said, interesting. Came back home and said, well, maybe we should look after, the problems that are taking place here, the Vietnam War at the time, the oil crisis in the 70s, and we got distracted. And there's plenty of things in this planet to distract us now. But I think we can find the resources somewhere to get a serious space program in place that doesn't just put shuttles bouncing around in our atmosphere and building space stations that don't really make much scientific sense, and say, there's answers out there, there's resources out there that we might be able to exploit, if that's what you're into. If you believe the Earth needs more resources, and it probably does, let's go out and see what's happening. It's what sets us apart from the rest of the animals, our inquisitive nature to explore. And it's been a big mistake not to go, and I think ufology could really benefit, and some ufologists do, from trying to link themselves with the space movement and say, maybe the best way to find out if they're coming here is for us to start going out there. Who knows who we'll meet?
Paul, the mother of my children, my ex-wife, was born in Canada. She was born in Windsor, so I've got a very closeness with Canadians, and maybe one of the few talk show hosts in the country to talk about this relationship, this true relationship between Canada and the United States. Even though so many people feel as if there's tension and things, there is remarkably an affection, a brotherhood between our people that is unmatched. But let me ask you a silly question that I really don't know. One is why haven't we ever worked together in any specific space endeavors? And two, do you have nuclear weapons? Does Canada have them?
No, not that any Canadians know of. We did test cruise missiles, and we tested in the 50s and 60s Beaumark missiles. I believe they were Beaumarks. Canada certainly has the capability, far faster than Iran. We could build nuclear missiles if we wanted to. We have nuclear reactors. Stan Friedman has worked on one in New Brunswick at the Point Lepreau nuclear reactor project. So, obviously, as an industrialized first world nation, we have that capability. We don't have those weapons. In terms of the space program, Canada and the United States have worked very closely. Every time you send a shuttle up and the arm comes out, Americans should remember who built that. We did. That's our arm. In Canada, we actually call it the Canadarm. We've sent astronauts up. The first Canadian in space, I believe, was Marc Garneau. He's certainly the most famous. He recently ran for the Liberal Party in our last election a few months ago, lost, unfortunately. I generally don't support the Liberals anymore, but I supported him because I thought he would have been a fine member of Parliament, a true Canadian hero. And he's worked with Canada's space agency. We do have one. It works closely with NASA. I believe it probably works closely with the European Space Agency.
But you've never launched anything on your own, right?
No. I think Canadians, generally speaking, tend to be cooperative people. We like to build partnerships with others. The United States has far more resources than we can bring to bear. So why not piggyback on the American space program and bring certain elements of our own ingenuity, our own industriousness to the project, which is basically what we've done militarily as well over the years. Canadians, we can field a very large army and navy if we really wanted to. We did in the Second World War. When the war was over, we had the fourth largest navy in the world. Very few people remember that. We actually had aircraft carriers. But, we don't do that. Instead, what we do is we do things like mine sweeping, and we take on peacekeeping chores that maybe the Americans don't want to do or don't feel they're suited to do, and provide brigades, as we do now in Afghanistan, to help lighten the load there. So we make our contributions usually as part of a much greater coalition or a greater partnership or whatever term you want to use, and I believe we've done that with the space program as well. It's the stereotypical Canadian way. We like to work with people.
Okay, well, there's nothing wrong with that. All right, let's talk about your two films. First of all, Best Evidence. Some cases you obviously can't tell us about. They're in the film. You don't want to reveal that to us right now. But tell us about some great cases that you like.
Well, there's no question that one of the best cases of all time is the RB-47 case from 1957. And I was interviewing Brad Sparks about that case tonight, and I'll make no bones about it. That one I'll reveal. The RB-47 case is on the top 10. Where it fits in the top 10, I won't say. But it's definitely on the top 10 somewhere, and it is uniformly regarded by ufologists, I think, as one of the best cases that there is out there, which might give you a clue as to which half hour it's going to wind up in the special.
Exactly.
It's an amazing case. The RB-47 was one of the United States' top surveillance planes in the 1950s and 1960s, saw extensive duty around the world in some very tight hot spots, had the best electronic sensor gear extant during the day, top-notch crews. I mean, these were the creme de la creme of the Air Force that were flying these things and that were serving as electronic warfare officers, listeners. They called them ravens. For some reason. I think it's because they took it from a British term. The British called them crows or something like that. And these guys, in this particular case, a training mission over the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas too, I think, and then up into Oklahoma, were tailed basically by a UFO. I sort of call the case the tailgater. They were tailed basically by a UFO for almost 2 hours. They tracked it on their equipment in their plane. It was tracked by radar on the ground. The pilot saw it as a bright light. It's just simply an amazing case that not enough people know about, and it's going to be a real pleasure to bring that one forward. The interesting thing is it's not the only RB-47 case out there. There are others that are even less well-known, but just as interesting. I talked with I should make one other point about the RB-47 case. Sorry, the famous one, the 1957 one, famous amongst some ufologists at least, if not the general public. The guys, the crew that were in that plane were the creme de la creme of the creme de la creme. They were an older crew. Two of the electronic countermeasures officers, or the name, the guys working the gear and the guts of the plane, were guys who trained other people. So these were guys that were highly thought of by even their own peers within the RB-47, within the 55th Air Surveillance Squadron. I think it's Air Surveillance. Sometimes I get my military terms mixed up. But you can check on my blog. There it is. These were good guys, and this was a great plane, and that's the kind of, with radar sighting it on the ground, a prolonged sighting that nobody could explain. There's no explanation that's ever been offered by anyone. That's the kind of case that you just go, okay, if you're a skeptic, and I'm a skeptic, about the ETH at least, you've got to sort of at least sit back and go, well, there's definitely something up there. Now we sort of we're beyond that hurdle, so now let's try and figure out what it is. And I think, for me, I'm at the point of trying to figure out what it is. Other people have gone further than that. They already think they know what it is. That's a leap that I'm not prepared to make yet. But that case alone, as far as I'm concerned, is enough to prove that there's an objective reality to the UFO phenomenon.
Do you touch in best evidence any astronaut cases or things that they think they may have found on the moon? Who knows what?
Yes, there is going to be one astronaut case on the list, and that one I will keep secret. But yeah, there is an astronaut case on the list, one that probably isn't talked about as much as it should be. It's very difficult to track down. You can find it in one or two books. It involves photographs, which might be a clue for some people. But it's a good case, and it's on the list, yeah.
How do you feel, Paul, about so many stories that we hear that government is holding back? They're not disclosing. They're not going to tell us what's going on. Do you believe that to be true, or could you say as a skeptic, come on now, they don't say anything because they don't know anything?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that the government has withheld information. The question is, what information have they withheld, and for what reason have they withheld it? And that's where I differ from the people who believe in things like, the cosmic Watergate.
Sure.
I believe that...
Your uncle.
Exactly. I believe that if the government's withholding information, it might be for national security reasons that really do relate, in some cases, to sources and methods and things like that. And in other cases, I believe the government's withholding information because they're just plumb embarrassed that they don't know what's going on. I honestly don't believe that the government knows what's going on. I believe they're embarrassed to admit that the air forces, either in Britain or Canada or the United States or wherever they are, can't control our skies, that there's something up there, whether it's a natural phenomenon or aliens from space or whatever it is, that they just can't explain. And I think it's understandable that if that's the case, they would be unwilling to admit that they can't explain it. So they try and explain it away. which is what the U.S. Air Force did for many years, or they just ignore it altogether. But I don't think I've seen no evidence. I don't believe that there's a massive cover-up to reverse engineer alien technology. I'm not a believer in the crash flying saucer tales. I don't think any of those are real. Certainly none have been proved to my satisfaction. I don't believe the government's got UFO technology stashed at Area 51. No. But is the government covering something up? Yes. I think what they're covering up, and this should be easier for people to believe, given the events of the last few years, I believe they're covering up their own general incompetence and their own failure to come to grips with the phenomenon, whatever it is. So you see something like the British report come out, where again they say, well, plasma, and I generalize, but basically trying to explain it away, even as they admit it exists, and that to me is very telling, very telling.
Stephen Greer, whom you, I'm sure, know about,
yes,
pulled out at this Toronto exopolitics meeting a week or so ago. Pulled out Paul Hellyer in Toronto.
Yes.
And I don't think he should have done that for the reasons we've already talked about. He has, however, accumulated some pretty good people who claim that some very strange things have happened.
Absolutely. I've interviewed at least one of those people recently. There's another clue, although it's a very long list of people. So I asked that person when I interviewed them what they thought of Dr. Greer, not on camera, but between he and me, and he just rolled his eyes. He was part of the Disclosure Project, one of the witnesses who came forward, former military officer, and he was sorry he ever got involved with it. I've interviewed Dr. Greer many years ago, 2001, didn't use it in the film because I didn't want to undermine the credibility of the film I was doing at the time. I think Dr. Greer has been a bane on ufology. I think he's been one of the worst things that's happened. I think
you do.
Dick Hall has made the point over and over and over again that there was some movement towards congressional hearings on the UFO subject in the 1990s, which effectively came to a screeching halt when Stephen Greer began his Disclosure Project. Because what he did was he took good witnesses, and there were a number of good witnesses within the Disclosure Project, but unfortunately he mixed them in with a number of bad witnesses. And you're only as good as the weakest link in your chain. And so if the weakest link in your chain is a UFO nutball who says he's been talking with aliens from Venus, I paraphrase, of course, but somebody who is not credible, and there were a number of people at the Exopolitics Disclosure Group tout as legitimate witnesses that serious ufologists, including Stan, Kevin Randall, Dick Hall, Brad Sparks, Jerry Clark, will tell you these people have no credibility. You mix those people in with people that are credible witnesses, and the people who suffer are the credible witnesses. And I think Dr. Greer has done a great disservice to the serious study of the UFO phenomenon over the last 10 years or so.
So maybe in his effort, his zeal to get something done, Paul, he went a little too far, you think?
Well, I think you go a little too far when you start charging people hundreds of dollars to wander around fields at night waving flashlights at the sky trying to bring down alien spaceships, too. That's the kind of stuff that ufology doesn't need if it wants to be taken seriously by science, by the dreaded mainstream, by anybody, quite frankly.
I like you, Paul. I'll be back with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, our condolences to Peter, who lives in Arizona, because he has just returned from New York at the loss of his father, who he says used to listen to Coast religiously every night, so much so Peter is now a fan of the program. Peter, just want to let you know that part of the family, we give you and yours full condolences on that. Next hour, we'll open up the phone lines to give you an opportunity to chat with Paul Kimball, but when we come right back, we'll chat with him about some of his work, some of his films. That's next on Coast to Coast AM. Well, Paul, before we talk about the Fields of Fear film that you've been working on one of your blogs, you wrote a story about some of the top 10, top worst in ufology's history. Jacques Vallée heads the list. Edward Condon, he's on the bottom. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Everybody loves top 10 lists. Obviously, I'm doing a film on it, so I thought these were mine. I later ran a poll, actually, too, that had, I think, around 200 people voted, that said which ufologist on this long list is the top one, and Vallée won that poll, too, which is very interesting to me. Where is Jacques Vallée? Well, I know where he is. He's up in San Francisco. But why is Vallée not part of ufology anymore, or at least not part of ufology in an ongoing way?
Well, and he doesn't seem to want to. Exactly. As a matter of fact, Paul, I've been trying to get him on the program. He doesn't want to go there anymore.
Yeah, and I think a large part of that is because he was driven away by the extraterrestrial hypothesis people, the believers in ET, who couldn't countenance somebody who would think outside the box and start looking at other possible explanations. Now, I don't want to speak for Dr. Vallée. I've corresponded with him a couple of times, very friendly, and he's been helpful. And I think he continues to do that on a more personal basis, and perhaps he is even working through what he called the invisible college. But Jacques Vallée was a tremendous resource to ufology, truly one of its deep thinkers, and sort of losing him from the ongoing development of ufology, of ufological studies, of serious scientific research into ufology, I think was a great loss. And I think that's what happens when you become too wedded to one particular theory, when they are all still theories, and you start driving people like Vallée away. In the case of Condon, it's interesting, in the last half hour there I was criticizing Stephen Greer, and I'm a frequent critic of exopolitics, and I think Dr. Greer was on my list of the top 10 worst of all time. But at number one was Dr. Edward Condon. And, Condon was by no means a UFO believer or somebody like Billy Meyer, perhaps, that tends to have these wild, outlandish tales. He was a serious scientist who commissioned a report, or didn't commission a report, but the Air Force commissioned a report that he authored, the Condon, the University of Colorado study, and then the Condon report, which is one of the defining moments in ufological history, because it basically set the tone for the next 40 years. He came out and he said, there's nothing to this. It can all be explained, even the ones that we actually can't explain. I'm sure those can be explained. There's no scientific merit to this. Go away. And there's no coincidence. I've talked about this on my blog. If you look at the records of the Canadian House of Commons, for instance, which I have, very few people have, but I have. I've gone through them in the 50s and 60s. There were a number of members of Parliament who took UFOs seriously. They asked questions about particular cases, the Stephen Michalek case in particular, but they also asked questions about UFOs in general every now and then. Yes, they made a few jokes about them too, but I actually make a few jokes about UFOs sometimes, so does Stan. But it was being taken seriously by some serious people in Canada's government, parliamentarians. They would ask questions in the House of Commons. And then as soon as the Condon report came out, basically nothing.
That was it, yeah. Shut it down.
There's been one question in the House of Commons since about UFOs, and it was in the 1970s, and the question was basically, why did you give $6,000 to this guy to write a report on the history of UFOs? And it was, like, what a waste of money. Because they said, fine, the U.S. Air Force, through this distinguished scientist, Edward Condon, in this study, has explained UFOs. So why, there's nothing more to talk about, is there? And that, I think, is why Condon ranks as the worst person in the history of ufology. He's not a fraud, he's not a huckster, he's not a hoaxer. He's just a guy who, sort of a turning point in history, and he turned it the wrong way. For any one of a number of reasons. And people can speculate about what those reasons were, but I just think he got it wrong. And he was predisposed to get it wrong because he didn't think much of UFOs. The interesting thing is, in the late 1990s, another distinguished scientist, Dr. Peter Sturrock, put together a group of scientists for a much shorter period of time, the Sturrock panel, and he invited ufologists to come in and present what they considered some of the best evidence. Mm-hmm. I think Vallée was one of them, and Mark Rodiger from QFOS was another, and there were Michael Swords, and there were many others. And the Sturrock panel, which a lot of pro-ET ufologists kind of went, sort of said, look, none of these cases prove that these things are extraterrestrials. Fine. That annoyed a lot of ufologists.
Sure.
But what they missed, again, forest to trees, they seem to always hit the trees and miss the forest, is that the Sturrock panel, in particular Dr. Sturrock, came forward and said, we still believe this is worthy of serious scientific study. The Condon report got it wrong. Even though there's no proof that this is extraterrestrial, there are things up there that we should be looking at. science might learn something from this. And who knows? Maybe I don't think Sturrock ever said this, but the implication was, I don't know, maybe they are extraterrestrial. We won't know until we look. And he set out a very sort of, they set out a very relatively rigid set of criteria for how the study of the UFO phenomenon should proceed. So on my blog, what I did is I wrote 2 columns. I wrote one called The Condon Effect, which I think ufology has been suffering from for almost 40 years, a chilling effect. And then I wrote, look, here's how you combat the Condon effect. I called it the Sturrock Gambit, but the better way to put it probably would have been, that's kind of the clever turn of the phrase, but the better way, the Sturrock approach. And just type in Sturrock, Sturrock, in my blog, and you'll read about what the Sturrock approach is. I think that's the approach that ufology should be taking. Good way to start would be to mail every member of Parliament or every member of the House of Representatives and the Senate down here at least one chapter from Dick Hall's UFO Evidence, Volume 2. Probably the one on military sightings, because I think most people believe that military service personnel are pretty credible witnesses. Mail them that chapter, get Dick's permission to photocopy it, and send it to all of them. And say, look, Congressman, Member of Parliament, read this, or have your assistant read it. I guarantee you somebody's going to read it. Not all of them, but somebody will read it, and they might actually look at it and go, Also mail them a copy of the Sturrock panel report. Don't gloss things over. Admit, yeah, they didn't say it was ET, but point out and highlight the sections where they say we need serious, sustained scientific study of that, which requires government money. Either that or you get a very big series of private investors, but it probably requires government resources and government money. Now, if you believe the government's covering everything up and they're in league with the aliens and all that, this is not the approach for you. As far as I'm concerned, you're lost already, at least to people like me. However, if you haven't gone to that extent yet, then the Sturrock approach is the way forward, because it will lead to a serious, sustained scientific study. The French are already starting one up again through their space agency,
they are. Good.
NES. I believe, I can't remember what his exact position was. It's a committee, but the guy who's heading it, I think, is the former director of scientific intelligence for NATO. I may have that wrong. It's on my blog. I got it right on the blog. That's an interesting development in 2005 that very few people talked about. But I did a list of the top 10 things that happened in 2005, and I put that at number 2. Because any time a government takes the UFO phenomenon seriously, or a government agency, that's cause for, if not rejoicing, at least interest. So, yeah, the Sturrock approach, the way forward, and get rid of the Condon effect, which, we've been languishing under for 40 years.
Is J. Allen Hynek on your list at all?
Absolutely. I think he was at number 2.
Yeah.
Stan calls him an apologist ufologist. Sounds great with the turn of a phrase. I just think that's absolutely wrong. I think Hynek was one of the great figures in UFO history, one of the unsung heroes of ufology. Everybody knows about him, but every time you hear Hynek's name, you usually hear in the same sentence swamp gas.
Yes, you do.
And I think that's a shame. It's everybody can make a mistake. He made one. He owned up to it. He said,
he admitted it, and he changed his mind.
Absolutely. He said, I goofed, and he moved, and, fine. Why focus in on that? But I think the reason pro-ET ufologists sometimes don't like Hynek is because he wouldn't come out as forcefully as they would want and scream from the rooftops that UFOs are extraterrestrial. Towards the later years of his life, he became more inclined, I guess, to that view.
Well, his book, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was what Spielberg based his movie on, tells you right there that he was a believer.
Yeah, as he moved along, but even then, towards the later years of his life, I think he moved away from the extraterrestrial hypothesis and started considering maybe perhaps more extra-dimensional type stuff. He was a very open-minded guy. I have a great deal of respect for Hynek. I'd never call him an apologist ufologist, with all respect to Stan. I think he was one of the top 10, and I put him at number 2, and I think on the poll I conducted, he came in at number 2 as well. James McDonald was another, Dr. James McDonald, one of the giants of ufology that very few people outside ufology know about now, which is a shame. Stan's another one. Stan is, when the Peter Jennings special came out, he was referred to as a Roswell promoter, and everybody, including Stan, took offense. I didn't. I think it's an accurate term because he does promote Roswell. Now, I know people said the pejorative angle on that is he's doing it for the bucks, but that's one way of looking at it. I look at it as Stan is a very effective promoter of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, of the cause that UFOs are real and should be taken seriously. I've seen him give a number of lectures. I think in Stan's case, promoter is a good word to use, and I mean it when I use it at least, if not the Jennings people, in the kindest possible way, because every field of study needs somebody like that, a popularizer, somebody who can speak to large bodies of people effectively and intelligently.
Carl Sagan, very good at that.
The funny thing is, Carl Sagan was very good at it too, and both of them went to the same university together, and they held radically different views about what UFOs might represent, but they both had something in common in that they could speak to large groups of people and make them understand the concepts that they were talking about. And the thing that I hope Stan goes back to, and I think he is, I've heard rumors from Stan that he's working on a book about science and UFOs. And I think for far too long, Stan's been talking, and if you're listening, Stan, don't hold this against me, we're still pals, but Stan's been talking about government cover-up, Cosmic Watergate, Roswell, and MJ-12. And I think that's a mistake Stan made a number of years ago, and if he is going to go back and write a book, I really hope he does, and I hope somebody publishes it, and I hope it sells a lot of copies, on the science of UFOs, because Stan is a scientist. And I think he'd be a good guy to write that book, so I hope he does it.
You remember the movie, though, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Wasn't the Frenchman in the movie based on the life of Jacques Vallée?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was based loosely, as I understand it, on Vallée. Yeah.
Okay.
It's an interesting film. And stories around it, like, was it screened for, President Reagan? And he said, you have no idea how true this might be. I don't believe any of that sort of stuff. But yeah, it's a film. But people should remember that films are films. They're fictional stories. And if you can find a kernel of truth in a fictional story, it might sometimes be by accident. But there are people out there that look at Close Encounters of the Third Kind and view it as a documentary. And it's not. On the other hand, there are people out there that believe Independence Day and Men in Black are documentaries. They're not either. They're fictional films. So, but yeah, Vallée, Jim Moseley. There's another one. Very few people might cite Jim Moseley as one of the great figures of ufology, but every field of study needs a court jester, and Jim Moseley, who's been around for 50 years, currently publishing Saucer Smear, is one of my favorites, so he'd make the list too. Dick Hall was another one. Dick's one of the icons of ufology.
Who was number 9, right above Condon?
Phil Klass. Phil
Klass.
Klass made both lists. He made the top 10 ufologists of all time, or the top 10 ufological figures, and the bottom 10. He made the top 10 for me simply because you couldn't ignore him. He had a profound impact on the field, for good or ill, sometimes for good. People forget that. And perhaps more often than not for ill. But what Klass did, and every field, like they need a court jester, everybody needs a devil too. And if Klass hadn't existed, somebody would have had to invent somebody like Klass, or somebody else would have come along. He forced ufologists, and Bruce Maccabee has talked about this, to refine their research, to cross the T's and dot the I's, if for no other reason than to make sure that Phil Klass couldn't pick them apart. And to cover their bases. And I think it was Maccabee that said that, but Kevin Randall said the same sort of thing. Others have too. So he could be disagreeable sometimes. He could be vicious sometimes, especially when he attacked James McDonald many years ago. But by all accounts, he was quite pleasant in person. I never met him. But he performed a valuable service. And I think people maybe missed that when he passed away recently, last year. And some of the people who came forward were less than kind. You should never speak ill of the dead. But in Klass's case, I think in particular, they just sort of missed the boat in that he should exist. People like him should exist, because by confronting people like him, it makes your own research better, stronger, and that's important. But there are better skeptics out there than Phil Klass in terms of just pure talent and in terms of their reasoning too.
Isn't it interesting how that those people on your top list have devoted, or they had devoted, their lives to trying to uncover this entire situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Jim and Cora Lorenzen from APRO were on the list too. They devoted a large portion of their lives to it. I don't know if Jim McDonnell, for instance, devoted his entire life, but he devoted the last few years of his life to it, and it was a large part of his life. Valet obviously has other interests, many other interests, but he devoted a large part of his life to it. Certainly Hynek did, certainly Stan has, certainly Jim Moseley has, Dick Hall too. These are people that as ufology moves forward, none of these people are young anymore. Some of them are dead, like the Lorenzens and now Phil Klass. Stan is in his 70s. I think Valet's in his late 60s or 70s. Dick Hall is in his 70s. You can go down the list. The ones that are alive, unfortunately, won't be with us much longer, relatively speaking. Unless we can download their intelligence into cyborg bodies, which is a whole different
we
show.
can't do that yet. No, but is there a crop, Paul, of younger people, younger Stanton Friedmans, younger J. Allen Hyneks, younger Jacques Valets, who will pick up and run with this?
It's interesting. In terms of the scientists, and you just mentioned Jacques Vallée, Hynek, McDonald, Friedman, all scientists, I honestly don't know. You don't see very many of them out there in the ufological community.
No.
I think there are a number of them who are interested behind the scenes. But there are a number of people out there who are doing very good work. I disagree with him sometimes, but he's a close friend of mine, Nick Redfern. People think that sometimes maybe Nick just writes books, but Nick also digs out documents and does a lot of good research. And while I disagreed with him completely about his Body Snatchers in the Desert book, I've read other things by him that I quite like, and he worked with us on the Fields of Fear project with the cattle mutes. Mac Tonys, you can see his stuff at mactonys.com. Very bright young fellow, 30 years old. I think he's got a new book that he's hoping to have come out in a year or two about crypto-terrestrials as a possible theory behind UFOs.
Oh,
and he's a really bright guy, and he wrote a book on the face on Mars and blogs regularly at a blog called Posthuman Blues. Two others that I'd mention would be Greg Bishop, who wrote what I thought was the best UFO book of last year, Project Beta, the Benowitz story, which was, I think, criminally overlooked by ufologists in general, largely because it contained some truths that I think they're uncomfortable in confronting sometimes, namely that they've been disinformed by the government over and over again for reasons that usually have nothing to do with UFOs, and they just don't want to admit that maybe they've been taken for a ride by certain people within the government. And I think Greg's book makes that point really well, and I think it's a book that more people should read.
What about the young kid, John Greenwald? Does he have a future?
I like John Greenwald. John Greenwald, you need people to go dig stuff out. It's not terribly hard. You just need to be persistent. It's hard in the sense that you need to spend a lot of time, sometimes some money, and you need to be persistent at it. But once you get good at it, and John, who I interviewed a few years ago, when he was even younger, very bright young guy, yeah, sure, he has a future in ufology, as long as he stays away from conspiracy theory too much, and he sticks on the straight and narrow. I'll mention one more real quick. William Wise, who runs the Project Blue Book Archive, great resource on the web, and he's in his 30s. He's a very bright young guy, too, out of Virginia.
Great.
Keep an eye on him.
Cattle mutilations in Canada. We're going to talk about that and take your phone calls next on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, we're going to talk about this cattle mutilation situation in Canada. Then we'll take your phone calls right here on Coast to Coast AM with our guest, Paul Kimball. Don't go away. Paul, the cattle mutilation story in Canada. Now, this one intrigues me. How long have you been investigating it? What led you into this film, Fields of Fear?
I got to tell you first, George, it's great to be sort of played in by the Zombies. That's cool. One of my favorite bands. Cattle mutilations. Well, Fern Belzile, whenever you make a film in Canada, it always helps to have a Canadian angle. That's a long story. But I was originally looking at making a film about chupacabras, actually. And it was sort of indicated to me that maybe chupacabras had been done, if not to death, then perhaps, to a slow roast. And if I could find a Canadian angle to sort of mutilation stories of some sort, the network would be amenable to that. And so I took a look, and I ran across Fern Belzile up there in northern Alberta, St. Paul, which is about an hour and a quarter east of Edmonton. And I took a look, and I found out, Fern's a fascinating guy. And he's Canada's leading cattle mutilation investigator. I think a lot of people think that the cattle mutilation phenomenon is restricted to the United States. It's not. There are a number of cases in Canada. Fern's investigated them, and he has his conclusions, his data. He's worked in the past with NIDS and other people in the United States, so it's sort of a cross-border thing, I guess. But for me, as a filmmaker, what you're always looking for, as well as the cold, hard data, as it were, and the theories, is there a human story here? And Fern's, I think he's in his late 70s, and he's a crusty old guy. Years, 40, 50 years as a top cattle farmer, award winner. You should see his wall. He's got banners and trophies. The guy knows his cattle. So that lends a veneer of credibility to him that perhaps most mutologists, or whatever you want to call them, don't have, because he spent his life around these animals. So when he talks, regardless of what you think about cattle mutilations, you at least sort of have to listen to him, because he's raised these animals his entire life. And he certainly has the respect of the people in his community up there in St. Paul and in the area around it. So cattle mutilations are interesting in and of themselves, but Fern provided a very human angle to the story that always intrigues any filmmaker, I think. And that's, the film's as much about him as it is about the subject of cattle mutilations.
Well, I love his name. Did he ever have cattle mutilations on any of his farms?
No. Again, here's a guy who, it's a very interesting story. St. Paul built a UFO landing pad purely, and they admit it, as a tourist idea in 1967, which was Canada's centennial. So there was a lot of money flowing around to build things, and they built a UFO landing pad for no particular reason. They just thought it would be a good draw. As it turns out, it was. In the early 1990s, their Chamber of Commerce decided to add a building to the UFO landing pad shaped like a flying saucer that would serve as the town's Chamber of Commerce. And they thought a good stunt, and again, they make no bones about it, it was a publicity stunt, would be to set up a UFO hotline. But they would take the UFO calls seriously as they would come in. And amidst the UFO calls that were coming in, they started to get some calls about cattle mutilations. And Fern knew the general manager of the Chamber of Commerce at the time, Paul Peltier, who we interviewed for the film as well. They got a call one day, and Fern just happened to be walking into the office, and Peltier said, "Hey, we just got a call from Saskatchewan. There's a cattle mutilated there. They want us to go have a look at. Would you come?" And Fern said, "Sure, I'm not doing anything else. I'm retired. Why not?" And he went, and I think Paul Peltier is quoted in the film as going, "Wow." I think that's his exact quote. Yeah. Fern's a little more circumspect. He doesn't go, "Wow." He says, "Well, when I first got there, I thought maybe this is not real." But then he talks about the reasons why he believed that case was real, as a cattle mutilation and a paranormal anomalous event, and why he goes on to generally believe that there is an anomalous, perhaps paranormal aspect to cattle mutilations that can't be explained simply by, most people say predators. The proper way to put it, I think, would be scavengers, animals that come along and scavenge animals that are already dead. Because the term predators implies that maybe some small coyote pulled down a cattle, and that's not quite correct. The idea is that the cow dies and the scavengers wander in and inflict the wounds. So that's Fern. That's his story, and he's in the film. Kevin Randall's in the film, taking a very skeptical look at it. Kevin is one who believes that cattle mutilations, or is convinced rather, that cattle mutilations can be explained in prosaic terms, scavengers, by and large, with a few hoaxes thrown in.
Did you talk with Linda at all, Bolton Howe?
No, I didn't. Did talk to Nick Redfern. There are other people involved in the film. Didn't talk to Linda Moulton Howe, no.
And in terms of Fern's, and I know because this is a film, you don't want to give out the bottom of it, but is he convinced beyond just paranormal that, yes, there are some natural occurrences here, yes, there are some animals that are scavenging cattle, but that there's something else going on too?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's not a leap I would make, but as a filmmaker, it's not about the leaps that I would make, it's the leaps that the subject would make. And Fern is very cagey, and Greg Bishop's in the film, interviewed about cattle mutilations and the history of it, and Greg said something very interesting. He said, Fern, for a guy that you might write off as a simple country bumpkin farmer kind of guy, is a very cagey guy. He doesn't come right out and say what he thinks they are. He will tell you in his lectures, I don't think it's this, I don't think it's this, I don't think it's this. And if by the process of elimination you kind of go through it, it's pretty clear that he thinks it's probably aliens, or at least aliens are involved in some of them. But he won't say that. And Greg Bishop made the point that's in the film, and I think it's a very good point, that that's probably the best way to approach it if you are convinced that maybe it's aliens, or conversely, if you're convinced that maybe it's the government doing it, is to not come out and say that directly, but to sort of say that is probably the most likely way to do it. And that way you tend to not drive off people who might sort of say, well, you're just a UFO wingnut. And I think Fern's been pretty successful at that. I've seen him at his lectures, and people keep an open mind when he presents his evidence. And he does it pretty well, too. I think people will be captivated by him when they see the film and go, yeah, this guy, whether you believe or not in what he's telling you, this is a guy that walks the walk and not just talks the talk, rather, but he's walked the walk for many years. So let's listen to him.
How were some of the cattle mutilated, Paul? I mean, was it very difficult to determine?
Well, that depends on your point of view. If you sort of believe that they're scavengers, then there's relatively easy explanations for all of it. Fern, describes wounds with surgical precision and laser cuts and stuff, as Linda Moulton Howe does.
Which can't happen from an animal.
No, but other people, like Kevin Randall and like any one of a number of veterinarians, and the much-maligned Ken Rommel and his report, which drew upon a wide range of veterinary expertise, will tell you that those wounds can be made by animals. They're not done with surgical precision or lasers. They just look like they're done with surgical precision or lasers. But in fact, for instance, coyotes can make very fine cuts that can resemble things, at least to the untrained eye, taking a relatively quick look, maybe to surgical precision. Kevin Randall brings up a very interesting point. He says every police officer who ever says that this looked like it was cut by a laser, the first question you should ask them is, have you ever seen anything that was cut by a laser outside of a Star Wars film?
No.
Do you actually know what a laser burn looks like? Have you seen flesh cut by a laser before? If they have, then okay, fine. If they haven't, well, you take that observation for what it's worth, which might not be very much. So just because you're a police officer, for instance, doesn't make you an expert on veterinary medicine or an expert on lasers or anything like that. So there's a very interesting debate that goes on in the film, primarily between Kevin and, which is interesting because Kevin's no debunker. Kevin's one of the arch proponents of the Roswell crash and a noted ufologist who believes aliens have visited our planet. On the issue of cattle mutilations, though, he just doesn't believe that aliens have visited our planet to mutilate cattle. So it's a difficult, he's an interesting, in this case, I guess, debunker in this instance. And it's a very interesting dichotomy between him and Fern Belzil as the film winds its way along. And Nick Redfern and Greg Bishop and some other folks chiming in as it moves along.
All right, as promised now, let's go to the calls west of the Rockies. You're on Coast to Coast with Paul Kimball. Hi there.
Hi there. My name's John. Morning from another fellow Canadian. I'm a truck driver coming up from Oregon, Washington.
Sure. Hi, John.
The thing that really gets me, and I was wondering if you come up against a wall, is the religious aspect of of all the UFO and thing. I mean, I'm a believer in UFOs and that, but you hear the backlash, and you hear the people say that well, that's impossible. We're the only chosen one, which I think is narrow-minded and naive. But do you ever get, how you get blocked off by the religious aspect? They think you're just, making this up. There's no such thing. It's never been, written or whatever. Because, I hear friends of mine who are, religious say, well, this can't be because, we're the only ones, blah, blah, blah. It just really annoys me that, they're so narrow-minded thinking that we're the only intelligent life in the entire universe.
There is a group, a subset within, in particular, say, Christianity, which is the predominant religion in North America, the evangelicals among the evangelicals, if you will, that some of them might believe that and act that way. Evangelicals I've talked to, however, and we have some in my family, so it does make for an interesting family reunion when Stan and I and some of the evangelical types get together. I find them very open-minded, actually. They ascribe a different explanation to it. Often you'll hear evangelicals say it's demons or something. But the important thing, again, is to note that they actually believe that the phenomenon exists, and then you're really discussing what you believe it is. But they don't necessarily deny that it exists. The funny thing is, I find that ufologists tend to run screaming whenever religion is mentioned. And sort of shut the doors and don't want to talk about it at all. There are exceptions. Barry Downing's book, The Bible and Flying Saucers, is a classic of ufological literature. I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing Barry some years ago when I was doing the Stanton T. Friedman Israel book. But there is, I think there is a religious aspect to this, perhaps, that ufology should look at, and there might be some common synergies here. And that's another 3-hour show to talk about some of those. But here's just one. What if UFOs are time travelers, which is possible, theoretically possible. Guys like Michio Kaku tell us this might be possible. Well, one of the basic tenets of most religions, and certainly of Christianity, is that God is eternal. A Canadian evangelist named Henry Allen referred to it as the eternal now. He's, as the Beatles said, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, it's all the same thing to God. Well, what if 5,000 years from now we figure out how to travel through time, or we figure out that time really is a nonlinear concept? Well, at that point, do we not become God? Because that's one of the fundamental properties of what we see God as being. And, then that opens up a whole can of worms, and we come back and we create ourselves and stuff like that. And I think those are some of the things that ufology should at least be willing to consider and talk about, if for no other reason than it makes for interesting conversation over a beer at a conference. But I think it goes beyond that, and I think ufology shouldn't be, in their quest to seem scientific, shouldn't turn their back completely on religion any more than religion should turn their back on the possibility that there's life on other planets or other dimensions.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's go first-time caller line. You're up on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Good
Hello.
evening. Good evening.
Go ahead, sir.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hi.
Okay, great. Good evening, guys. It's Robert from Los Angeles. I've been studying UFO phenomena for quite a while now, and this is really not something new. We've known about UFOs. We've been documenting it for hundreds of years, maybe in thousands of years. We have information in the Bible, a wheel in the sky which is turning. Anything round that they saw, I think you could think was a wheel, something in the sky round like a disc, and they said it's called a wheel. We have a picture. Have you seen the drawing of the Madonna? It's hundreds of years old, and you see a man pointing in the air with his dog, and here is a spaceship with a dome on it. There's someone inside of it. It has radio antennas on it, and it's inside of a photo. A drawing that's hundreds of years old. So we've been documenting this for hundreds of years throughout our history, and we have documents, in the Bible, and we have artists and drawings and stuff, museums. And I was just wondering. Since research I've been doing, I've met with people in Air Force and stuff. One-on-one, and when you do that, you don't really discuss what you're talking about. But our military does know about this. There are flying objects, of course, but the biggest part of the mystery isn't really are they real, are they here. There's thousands and thousands of photographs that people have taken of these things, so there's no question about it that it is real. The main thing that I found out about it is that they have the ability. These individuals who are flying these things have the ability to actually do things neurologically to people, to actually forget events that have taken place. For instance, a massive UFO sighting in California over the 101 freeway. On the 101 freeway, hundreds of cars saw a disc hovering above the freeway, and this was documented. But yet, after a few months after this happened, people forget about it. They forgot about it. I went on the street in the area where the UFO was seen, talked to people on the street, and they go, yeah, I remember that. But somehow their memory was erased, it seems, because they forgot about it. Do you know about the neurological part of the UFO phenomenon when people have seen UFOs And then automatically a week or two later, oh, yeah, that did happen. But why did it stay in their mind? And why, when a UFO occurrence happens, they investigate it 4 and 5 years after the fact rather than investigate it right after it happened? And this happens all the time in ufology. We have the lights in Arizona, Phoenix lights. It wasn't investigated immediately. It took years before people said, hey, that really happened. What's going on? There's some sort of neurological thing where people are actually have their minds messed with. And I was with some officers, and they're telling me, hey, they know that I'm a researcher, and they told me, hey, we've been seeing this light following us around. This seems to happen a lot with police officers. If you've done your research, you'll notice a lot of police officers out at night, and they see things, and they're excellent observers. And they told me, we see this light following us around. It's an orange glowing light. And I'm sort of laughing to myself, okay, an orange glowing light following you guys around. So I hung out with these guys. I'm not kidding you. I saw this thing. An orange glowing light. It looked like a balloon with a light in it. I couldn't make any sense out of it, what it was. I was with the guys, and we were gone. We were completely gone for 3 hours. We're totally gone. People trying to radio in, and we were totally gone for 3 hours. And I remember looking at this thing. I turn around, look at it, and then I drowse off, and my head turns away from it. I turn back, and it's closer. And they were doing something trying to keep us from looking at it. And every time we turned back, it was closer, then it was closer, then it was closer, and then we have 3 hours missing. And all of us were exhausted like we ran 100 miles. Okay? So they must have done some sort of, physical endurance thing or something on us, or whatever, but this phenomenon is pretty weird, being that close to it and being missing and people trying to contact you by radio, and you're not even there. And I'm sure you've heard these stories, haven't you?
Well, I got to tell you, you're a good researcher there, Bob. But Paul, do you want to comment on any of the things you just said before we hit the break?
There's a lot of cases, of course, that purport to have missing time incidents. The Hill case is probably the most famous. I think there's an awful lot of cases. I don't think it's quite accurate to say that and I don't think the caller was saying it, that every case people tend to forget. There's actually a lot of cases where people have very vivid memories,
right,
dozens of years later. But, to speculate, and here I'm only speculating, if they are extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional or advanced beyond us in any way, shape, or form, if they are, in fact, they, then it's probably reasonable to assume that they have technologies we wouldn't understand. And we're already starting to manipulate minds, and we have been for years trying to. And we just are at the very beginning of understanding how the mind works. So maybe if there are aliens out there, or extra-dimensionals, or time travelers, or whatever, they have a knowledge that we don't, and maybe they could possess those capabilities. So, yeah, sure, wouldn't rule it out, absolutely.
We'll come right back and take final phone calls with our guest Paul Kimball on Coast to Coast AM. Well, tomorrow's Wednesday already, and Michael Tazarian joins us. We're going to talk about the year 2012 and what all that means with Michael, and I'm looking forward to that. And by the way, just a reminder, Amazon.com is selling our book, Worker in the Light. It officially comes out September 19th, about the paranormal world, the unusual, and they are selling it at a substantial discount. If you want to jump on board with those pre-orders, it's at Amazon.com. The name of the book is called Worker in the Light. We'll be back in a moment. We'll wrap up with final phone calls with our guest Paul Kimball on Coast to Coast AM. Paul, where does a viewing public get a chance to see the two movies that are coming out, Fields of Fear and, of course, the UFO movie that we were talking about as well?
If you're in Canada, they'll be on Space, the Imagination Station, which is a major specialty channel, part of the Chum Group up in Canada. If you're in New Zealand, it's guaranteed you'll be able to see it on TV New Zealand, Best Evidence. If you're in the rest of the world, our distributor's working hard on getting it into your neighborhood, but you could always help that process along. You could always feel free to call the Sci-Fi Channel or some other channel and say, Best Evidence, Fields of Fear. You might want to call this guy and get those films on because we'd like to see them. And that's the only commercial plug I'll make on the entire evening. But we hope to have those films, once they're completed, the distributor will work very hard at getting into as many markets as possible. And certainly I'd like to have them in the American market because, A, it's profitable, and B, there's an awful lot of people down here that seem to want to see films like that, and I'd like I'd like them to see him, of course.
Did you ever investigate that 1952 flap over the White House, Washington, D.C.? That case just really boggles my mind.
Well, you should mention that, George. Folks should tune in to Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Cases.
Excellent.
And they may see something about the Washington flap. The interesting thing about the Washington case is there's more than just the sort of flap over Washington. There's, at the same general time, the Nash-Fortenberry case, which is an excellent UFO case. There's also a sighting by Paul Hill, who went on to become one of America's great scientists in the latter half of the 20th century. All of these things happening at the same time. So it's really there were a lot of bogus sightings then too, and it's tough with Washington to separate the wheat from the chaff. But the important thing to remember is for all the chaff that's there, there's some really good wheat that provides some wonderful ufological nourishment, as it were. So yeah, that's a very interesting case, and it's one of the classics of UFO history. Really, it was a defining kind of incident.
And I just brought it up. I have no idea what your top 10 UFO cases are.
There you go. It's psychic powers, really. Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
Wildcard line, you're on the air with us. Hi there.
Yes, my name is Jeff. I'm calling you from outside of New York City.
Yes, Jeff. Go ahead.
Mr. Norrie, it's a pleasure here listening to your program, and Mr. Kimball. Great work. We've got a few things in common. I'm a lawyer as well, and I'm also a filmmaker and a UFO researcher. So I have a case that you might find rather interesting. I think it addresses the issue you were bringing up about the possibility of time travel. And this came from my backyard down in Arkansas, and it was astounding. And it started me on the road to serious study. And it came about, I was looking through some documents on Project Blue Book, and I ran across you mentioned earlier, the UFO airship flaps.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that I was reared in a small town in Arkansas, and our county seat, which today has a population of about 2,100 people, is called Harrisburg, Arkansas. And the oldest weekly newspaper in the United States is the Modern News. And that happened to be one of the landing places for the airship on April 21st, 1897. I'm going to tell you, what was said there, I don't think anybody could dispute, was probably one of the best arguments for time travel that I've ever read. It's shocking, and I'd like to tell you a couple things about it. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
All right. Well, first of all places, it lands, there's this thing at 1 o'clock in the morning, they call it the airship, and they don't even have a name for, the astronaut driver, what do you want to call it? They call it the manager. He's an elderly man. He's described. This thing, the whole article in the paper, the paper's kind enough to send me photographs of the original newspaper from 1897. And I was reading it, and I could not believe it because, for instance, it lands in the backyard of the founding father of the town, Senator Harris, who was a senator. He had just left office, I believe, and his family, the descendants still live there. And it lands about 1 a.m., and it's taking on water from the well, hence hydrogen propulsion that we read about a lot for future, automotive travel, you might say. But more interesting than that, he gets in a discussion. Out comes Senator Harris with his eyeglass, and before he can even get up to his eye, this thing in the distance is suddenly lowering down in his backyard. So he walks out, and off comes this. It's referred to as the elderly gentleman. He was described as having a black beard down to his waist and deep sunken black eyes. And there were 2 or 3 other folks with him that on the ship that were taking on water from the well. And so they start chatting, and he mentions that he'd just been to Dallas. So I did a little research. Turns out, sure enough, he said he'd been to Dallas. He left about 45 minutes earlier, just left from Dallas. Now, from Dallas to Harrisburg, it takes about 12 hours to drive, and they did it in 45 minutes because the Dallas paper had that same date. Earlier in the evening, he landed in the yard of a gentleman by the name of John Barkley, and Mr. Barkley pulled a Winchester out, and he was quickly told by the elderly gentleman not to fire. He just wanted to buy some things from the local blacksmith, and he asked him for some bluestone, a couple of cold chisels, and some machine oil. And so that confirmed it was amazing. It was the same ship. Here it is 45 minutes later, it's gone this distance of several hundred miles, and it lands. Well, they start chatting, and he starts talking. First of all, he says, well, I've overcome gravity, and how I do that, if you recall in the article that appeared 26 years ago in the St. Louis such-and-such newspaper, you'll remember reading about so-and-so gentleman, and that man was my uncle.
It had to be the Post-Dispatch, by the way.
I didn't know. I couldn't read exactly the name. He said it was formerly called the St. Louis Republican, I think, or something, or something. Now it's changed to the St. Louis something else. He tells
Maybe then was the Globe Democrat.
I don't really know, sir. But what he says, there's a couple things in it that I just couldn't, you can't explain. I don't believe any other way. He mentions to the senator that he's overcome gravity by wrapping a wire around with this anti-gravity device he's got. He said it took him 19 years after he found, it took him the little device.
Is the guy human? Was he human?
Yes. As a matter of fact, he was human, and he's described in such a way. Take me another hour to tell you about a subsequent appearance of this man I have found appearing in New York in for lack of a better word, they've been called this Druid caves in upper New York State.
All right, and Paul, do you want this story, Paul?
I've got to give you a couple facts here. You will not.
Well, I tell you what. Let's give out your email address if you would, Paul. We're going to run out of time here, but
sure.
If he's interested and he could send that to you and you want to look at it, go ahead.
Absolutely, I'm always happy to look at anything. The email address is redstarfilm, REDSTARFILM @AOL.com. And if you go to my blog, which is currently posted on the Coast to Coast website, I guess, as a link, my email is right there on the blog, and it'll blink directly take you to my email and send it along. Absolutely. I'm always happy to read any case or any story. Doesn't mean I'll accept it or believe it, but I'm always happy to look at it because there is more than just post-1947 cases, and there's more on heaven and earth than in all your philosophy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
What a bizarre story that was, huh?
Yeah, and it's interesting. He mentioned he'd looked into the Project Blue Book files, which brings up an interesting point that I'd just like to make very briefly, that everybody can be their own UFO researcher. You just don't have to take my word for it or Stan's or anybody else's. There's a wonderful website that if you go to my blog, it's on the sidebar links, the Project Blue Book Archives. Just click on that, and it'll take you to all. They don't have all the Project Blue Book files up yet, but they're working on it. And you can read through thousands of pages. You can type in searches and say, I'd like to look for this, and see the real Project Blue Book reports and get a really good feel for the history of the UFO phenomenon, particularly in the United States. It's a wonderful resource, and I'd encourage everybody to take a boo, as they say, down under, I guess.
First time caller line, you're up on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Yes, my name is Sean. I'm a truck driver. I want to say first, George Norrie, that I definitely enjoy your program. I definitely like the guests that you have on.
Thanks, Sean.
My question, or I guess the question and comment. First, I do definitely believe in those what they call flying saucers or whatever you want to call them. But in our faith, in my faith, we do believe in flying saucers, and we believe them to the point where we believe that wheel that Ezekiel talks about and Isaiah talks about in the Bible is actually God's coming. And I know that's kind of deep for someone to believe that God could actually be on the spaceship, but that's just our belief. But I was just reading in a book of one of my teachers, and they was talking about a mother plane and the evidence of that, of a 1930s sighting that happened in Canada. And, it so happened that I turned on George Norrie and to hear, the guest to be a Canadian. So yes. I was just wondering if he had any thoughts or anything that he's come across about any 1930s sightings that may have happened in Canada with a police officer.
Okay, and while you think about that, Paul, let me ask you also, Sean, very quickly, when you say your belief system,
What religion are you?
Islam.
Islam. Okay. Well,
Yes,
that's
sir.
interesting. Okay, that is interesting.
Yeah. Well, we believe God exists in us. We believe God is a man that he traveled through time just like we do. Just like a horse exists, it existed 1,000 years ago, it exists today. And we believe that's how God exists. And we believe that God is a supreme being. So the quote-unquote life force that we may talk about as aliens, they're really not aliens. They're a highly intelligent form of us. Scientists say that we use 10% of our brain. Well, those particular aliens that we call that we don't know about are actually people who use more than 10% of their brain. And the Bible refers to them as angels. It refers to them as those who are sent on missions by God. So, in that instance, we believe God exists in man. He's just not some spirit we made after his form and image. But not to really go there, but we believe that God exists somewhere in this atmosphere and that he is in hiding. And in the book that I was reading, it talks about a mother plane that is 1.5 miles by 1 mile long, something of what you saw on Independence Day. Mm-hmm. Now, this sighting that was stated in the book happened in Canada. And I just read this before I even turned on the show. It's, not a coincidence. I believe everything happens for a reason. But it was a sighting in Canada by a police officer who say, and a couple other, matter of fact, it mentioned not only a police officer, but, multiple people saw this ship that actually looked like a small city.
All right. Well, let's see, Paul, did you ever come across that? And I'll let you, Sean, listen on your radio to his response. Do you know of this case?
I don't. And if anybody has details, feel free to email me or Stan or any other Canadian researcher, Chris Rutkowski. I'm sure we'd be interested to hear about it. There is a case that I do know of quite well in 1996 in the Yukon. Of a mothership. Stan refers to it as a mothership case. Multiple witnesses at multiple locations watching this thing fly over the northern Yukon, and the northern Yukon's fairly north because the Yukon's in the north anyway. And that's one of the really good cases out there. So what your caller was describing, what Sean was describing, is something that I'm familiar with, but in a case that happened 60 years later. And that's interesting in and of itself. The commonality, as Dick Hall often points out, of certain types of cases. You can group them in certain classifications. The religious angle, too, as we've talked about briefly before, George, is very interesting. Most chat groups or UFO forums out there have a religious form as well, and a spiritual form, and a parapsychology form. I belong to one that, again, you can access from my blog, a link on the side, UFO Planet. UFO/planet.net, and all of these groups out there, they talk about extraterrestrials and extradimensionals, and they also talk about science, and they also talk about religion. And I think there's commonalities and there's interrelationships between all of those things that can't be ignored and are worth talking about. And it's always worth having that kind of discussion. So what Sean just said, I find very interesting. And the concept, as we said earlier, of the eternal now, of God as a time traveler, that's some deep stuff. But it's interesting stuff too, and it's fun to chat about and to look into. Absolutely.
Are you getting reports of these large triangular-shaped objects all over the place, which I think might be military?
Yeah, one of the most well-known triangle object cases is the Belgian sort of flap, if you will, in 1989-90. I don't know what to make of the triangle cases, but there seem to be indications that they might be advanced military aircraft being tested. That's certainly what it seems like a lot of people think. But there are other people, and Nick Pope is one of them in the United Kingdom, that think very highly of the Belgian case and believes that it may, in fact, be something beyond just military aircraft. It might be paranormal. So, that's certainly, but it's certainly, again, as Dick Hall has pointed out in his UFO evidence, it's a type of case. There's a multitude of types of cases: cigar-shaped objects, motherships, cylindrical objects, the classic flying saucers, the triangles now. And when you start to see report after report after report all of them describing the same characteristics, you have to sort of sit up and take notice and at least take it seriously. It's not just an isolated incident, and that's important.
Do you think that the American people and the Canadian public believes in extraterrestrial visitations?
I think there's a segment that believe in it. I think there's another segment that are convinced that it's probably happening. I think both are probably smaller than some ufologists like to think. What I think, though, is that there's a large segment of the population that is open to, if presented properly, hearing about UFOs in a serious manner. And I think there's a large segment of the population, including many scientists, who believe, or are convinced, whichever term you want to use, that there's probably life out there beyond our little mud ball floating around in our little solar system. And I think both of those things open up opportunities for ufology to expand beyond its rather limited confines at the moment and try and engage a broader population in a broader conversation. And I think that's imperative if you're going to move ufology forward. But are there masses of people, a majority of people out there that believe aliens are landing on Earth or visiting? I don't think so. But I think there's a majority of people who are open to the idea of extraterrestrial life and maybe even open to the idea of extraterrestrial visitors. Possibly.
Paul, good luck on all your films, and let's keep in touch, my friend, all right?
Thanks, George. It's been a real pleasure. You'd make a great maritimer. And that's a good thing.
All right, that's Paul Kimball. For Karis Coburn, Dan Galante, Steve Carr, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesseur, Ross Mitchell, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell, I'm George Norrie. Somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM, I'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe.